Some cars arrive loudly. They break records, they dominate headlines, they become symbols of speed and power. And then there are cars that arrive quietly, cars that carry something more subtle, cars that arrive at the end of a story. The Nissan Silvia S15 was one of those cars. Not the loud beginning of a revolution, but the quiet closing of an era. To understand the S15, you have to travel back to a different era of Japanese engineering. An era when the idea of the driver still mattered above everything else. For decades, the name Silvia had represented something simple and pure. A lightweight coupe, rear-wheel drive, a car that did not try to overwhelm the driver, but instead worked with them. The Silvia had existed since the 1960s, evolving generation after generation, each version refining the same philosophy. Cars like the Nissan Silvia S13 and the later Nissan Silvia S14 had already earned a reputation among enthusiasts. They were not the most expensive cars, they were not the fastest, but they were something many drivers valued even more. They were balanced, and in many ways they belonged to a different philosophy of driving, one that was slowly disappearing. By the late 1990s, however, the world was beginning to change. Japan's economic bubble had long burst. Car manufacturers were becoming more cautious. Efficiency, safety, and global markets were becoming the new priorities. Inside Nissan, the situation was especially serious. The company was struggling financially, carrying heavy debt and facing uncertain years ahead. Soon, the arrival of Carlos Ghosn would mark the beginning of a major restructuring effort that would ultimately save the company. But it would also mark the end of many passion-driven projects. Small rear-wheel drive coupes were no longer easy to justify in a changing automotive world. And it was during this uncertain moment, at the edge of a fading era, that the final Silvia appeared. When the S15 was introduced in 1999, it looked sharper and more focused than any Silvia before it. Its shape was compact, almost aggressive. Narrow headlights gave the front of the car a determined expression. The body lines were tighter, more modern, but still unmistakably Silvia. It looked like a car designed by people who still believed in driving. Even as the industry around them was beginning to move in another direction, beneath that body lived one of the engines that enthusiasts would come to admire deeply: the Nissan SR20 DET. For many drivers, this engine would become legendary, not because of overwhelming power, but because of the way it delivered that power. It was responsive, it was balanced, it was almost alive. Combined with rear-wheel drive and a relatively lightweight chassis, the S15 became a car that seemed to communicate with its driver. Steering inputs felt immediate, corners felt natural. It was the kind of car that encouraged skill rather than brute force. The kind of car that belonged to a philosophy of driving that was slowly fading away. Because of this, the Silvia found a special place within a growing culture. Across Japan's winding mountain roads, known as the Toge, drivers began to push the limits of their machines. And on racetracks, another discipline was quietly growing: drifting. In the hands of skilled drivers, the Silvia S15 seemed perfectly suited for this art of controlled oversteer. The car moved through corners with a kind of rhythm. It was not violent, it was not chaotic, it was almost graceful. It wasn't long before the S15 became one of the most iconic drifting platforms in the world, a car born at the end of an era that helped shape a new culture. But even as its legend was growing among enthusiasts, the Silvia's future was already uncertain. The automotive world was changing. Manufacturers were shifting toward larger markets and safer investments. Cars built purely for the joy of driving were slowly disappearing. And so only a few years after its introduction, the story of the Silvia came to an end. In 2002, production stopped. The S15 became the final chapter of the Silvia lineage, a quiet goodbye to a name that had existed for more than 3 decades, the quiet closing of an era. Sometimes the most meaningful machines are not the ones that last the longest. They are the ones that arrive at exactly the right moment and leave behind a feeling that refuses to disappear. For many enthusiasts, the Silvia S15 became one of those cars, a reminder of a time when driving was still simple, when a lightweight coupe with rear-wheel drive could capture the imagination of thousands of drivers, when connection mattered more than numbers. And for me, the Silvia S15 is something even more personal. There are cars that you admire from a distance. There are cars that you respect for their engineering. But then there are few machines that simply stay with you. Cars that feel special for reasons that are difficult to explain. The S15 is one of those cars for me. Not just because of what it was, but because of the story it represents. The final chapter of a philosophy. A car built at the quiet edge of an era that was already fading. Today, years later, the S15 continues to live on racetracks, on mountain roads, and in the memories of those who understand what it meant. A small coupe that never tried to dominate the world, but somehow managed to leave its mark on it anyway. Sometimes the quietest cars tell the most lasting stories. And sometimes the quiet end of an era can become the beginning of a legend.